Hi, Jeff Simon here for SocialFlight. All right, now it is time for us to work on the rudder system. Now the rudder in the T-51D Mustang is controlled using cables. It's really the only primary control that's cable driven in the aircraft, and it goes from the firewall all the way around the rudder pedals, which have like an S loop in them that allow the rudder pedal mechanism to move forward and aft for taller and shorter pilots. And then it goes from there back to the bell crank that we assembled earlier, turns the bell crank, and then essentially uses the bell crank to split, where it controls the rudder itself with the upper coming off the bell crank, and then the lower part goes to the tail wheel. So that way we have tail wheel steering, we have rudder control, and then we go all the way to the forward rudder pedals. Now later, when we also install the rear rudder pedals, we'll attach those as well, and we're just going to run the cables for that now so that we have at least that in place, but we're not going to do the final installation of that. So let's talk a little bit about some of the hardware and what it's like to work with cables. Now cable, or what's also known as wire rope, is obviously pretty straightforward. You can get this in stainless, you can get this in regular metal. This gets supplied to us by Titan aircraft, and we're using 3/32 cable as part of this assembly, and it is known as 7x7, which is 7 strands around a 7-strand core in bundles of 7. So you can take a look at a close-up of that actually shows you these 7 bundles that go around a core, each of 7 strands. Now the way that this cable actually gets assembled is we use a process that's called a Nyko press. Now a Nyko press is a crimp. It's this sleeve that you can see right here, and you actually put the cable through one half of it, loop it around, and back through the other half. Now the other thing that you put in there so that it doesn't get pulled and the cable's protected when it's holding on to whatever component it's attached to is this piece, and this piece is called a thimble. Now the instructions from Titan aircraft tell us that we have to snip off the the little teeth there at the end of the thimble, but essentially what we do is we take this out, we route the cable around, I'll put the thimble in a minute, around and back in to the Nyko press sleeve, pull it down, put the thimble in place, and then that gets crimped. Now there's a special crimper that's available to do that, and I'll show you that in a second. But essentially that assembly that we're going to put in place winds up looking something like that. And then of course it'll all get secured using the crimp. So let's put that aside and talk about the tools. The first thing is, how do you actually cut cable? Well, here from Aircraft Tool Supply we have a dedicated cable cutter. It's this tool like this, and you can see it has a lot of leverage on 2 very stubby teeth that then, when they come together, pull the cable in, as you can see, and snip it. So very powerful, great set of tools to have if you're going to be working with cable. And then we also have 2 ways that we can do crimping. And we're going to actually do some experimenting with both of those, and we'll use whichever works out. So we have these crimpers that are obviously very large and allow us to go and crimp there. And then we also have this other tool as well from Aircraft Tool Supply that actually uses bolts to draw it in and crimp. So you actually just put it in place and then pull those, draw that tight as this die actually comes down. Now when all's said and done, you wind up with a crimp that you have to go and make sure has been done properly. And so to do that, we have this go, no go gauge. The go, no go gauge here actually gets sized around the portion of that Nyko press sleeve that's been crimped. So again, you pick the size that you're dealing with, and you go and check it with that. So that is the process that we're going to follow, and you can follow along for that. Now, to talk about some of the hardware, let's take a quick look at the pieces of hardware also that we're using. Now, we already talked about what the thimble is and what the cable or wire rope is. Here's the assembly that we start with up at the firewall. Now, it's important when you're dealing with cable to be able to vary the tension so you can set proper tension on the system. Titan aircraft does not specify a specific tension where they're going around the rudder pedals, just says it needs to not have excess slack in it. But once you get back towards the rudder, it does have tension settings that need to be set. And so for the forward part, we already put this assembly together, and that's this that you see right here. It's a bolt that actually goes through the firewall, so you can imagine the firewall being right here, and as you tighten the bolt, it actually pulls through and applies more tension on the cable. So that's how that works. Now, when you get back towards the rudder, we actually use something called a turnbuckle. The turnbuckle will go in line, and then as the barrel of the turnbuckle is rotated, that will extend or contract the entire mechanism, and this will all be safety wired in place when that's done, so it can't turn after the tension's been set. Next, we have to actually attach the cable to the bell crank that is actually controlling the rudder. That is done using this piece of hardware right here. This is called a clevis. It has a hole, and it has a section that goes around the cable, and actually the entire cable mechanism, if you know, the thimble will essentially be going through here, and that's how that will actually be done. And then there's a pin, which is where the term clevis pin comes from, that goes through the clevis and attaches it to a hole in the bell crank, allowing it to move back and forth, allowing it to rotate, and then this nice rounded section will actually be attached to the cable itself. Now, along the way, the cable has to route through bulkheads, etc., and there are areas that we want to make sure that the cable does not chafe against metal and incur any damage. That is done with something called a Fairlead. Anything that's protecting against chafing and allows cable to go through is called a Fairlead. The Fairleads for the Titan T-51 Mustang come in these two halves. You can see that's a half piece there. Each one gets put together to make a barrel, and then a snap ring gets put on over it to hold it together and also keep it then from moving. So there are weldments that are part of the steel fuselage frame that allow you to then push these Fairleads through, secure them with the snap ring, and then the cable rides through that hole, and if it's touching, it's not going to do any damage to the cable at all. And then the last piece that we have, rudder springs. And at that point, that's for the tail wheel. The tail wheel springs. That's for the tail wheel. We'll have all of this put back together, and once we get it all assembled, you will actually be able to sit, we will be able to sit in the cockpit, move those rudder pedals for the first time, and watch the rudder go along with it. And at that point, we will be able to check the box and say we have the entire tail being controlled from the cockpit. The elevator and the rudder, it's a good point. Let's get to work. All right, so we have 6 more cables that we need to do in order to finish our rudder control system. Why 6? Because when we go from this bell crank right here back to the rudder, we need to be able to set the tension on that. And to do that, we use these, which are called turnbuckles. Turnbuckle consists of each of the end ferrule pieces that the ferrule is attached to and this barrel. And the barrel twists. Each of these ends for the turnbuckle are threaded opposite so that when you turn this, the cable can stay in place and either extend or contract, and that's how you set tension on the cable. So we need to have 4 cables, 2 on each side of the rudder, going from the top of the bell crank here back, and then the bottom of the bell crank area has cables that go to the tail wheel. Now that only has 2 because they actually are connected to the tail wheel through a spring. That allows the tail wheel to have some play in it, and you're really exerting more force to pressure the tail wheel to move where you want to than actually forcing it, because of course you're going over uneven ground, etc. So there's lots of good reasons for that. So let's get to work and get the rest of our T-51 Mustang's rudder controls installed. As you go about a build, sometimes you find sections that you want to do just a little bit differently. Sometimes it's just to solve a problem differently, and sometimes it's just to see what happens when you put your own flavor into something. And so we had an idea here for the rudder cables. As they go from the bell crank back, they go through the pass-through here and then change direction a little bit and get rather close to the top portion of the tail wheel enclosure. Now, when we talked to the factory at Titan, they said that you can actually bevel the rear edge of the tail wheel enclosure to make sure that you have enough clearance for those cables. We came up with a different option with the help of SocialFlight guy. If you've ever been to any SocialFlight event, you have probably seen Paul Morrell. And Paul Morrell lives down on an air park in down in Georgia, Locust Grove, Georgia. Fantastic, gorgeous air park down there. And he and a friend of his, Roy, got together to help us, and they came up with this bracket. Now, what we can do here is we can mount this bracket here ahead of these and put pulleys on it that will actually raise up the level of the cables just before they get here. That will actually make a difference so that we don't have to worry about the aft edge of the tail wheel enclosure. And so we can now put all this together and see how it works. This is where I get to make airplane noises. All right, so that's it for the rudder control system on our Titan T-51D Mustang. It is so cool to be able to sit in the cockpit, move the rudder pedals, see the rudder move, see the tail wheel move. Everything is all set with this system, and we've got this great little customization project we did in the back to put pulleys in place, so no clearance issues that we have to make any changes for in the rest of the tail. And we couldn't have done that if it weren't for the help for the guys down at Mallard's Air Park. Thank you so much to Paul Morell for helping with the coordination and everything that he does for SocialFlight, as well as Benny. Benny is this great guy down there who actually taught me to be an A&P and now an IA, and also to Roy, who actually bent the sheet metal, made all this bracketry possible for us. So we've got this great thing. Those guys made it happen, and I love it when other people chip into our build. Until next time, thank you so much for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel here at SocialFlight, and also check out SocialFlight.com and the free SocialFlight mobile apps. There are tens of thousands of aviation events and destinations, airport restaurants, so much more. You could win prizes in our Fly to Win challenge. And if you write to us, you may even get one of these Titan T-51D Mustang build t-shirts. Until next time, I'm Jeff Simon. Thank you to everyone. Blue skies.